Appearances are the most dangerous camouflage of all. As a species, we are biologically wired to look for threats in the obvious places. We scan for the bulge of a hidden weapon under a leather jacket, the nervous, beady-eyed sweat on a traveler's brow, or the aggressive clenched fist posture of a man looking for a fight. We equate danger with size, with volume, with muscle. But true power, the kind of kinetic influence that shapes the history of nations and topples empires, rarely announces itself with a shout. It prefers the quiet, dusty corners. It prefers the shadows. It often hides in the fragile, trembling frame of those we deem too weak to matter, wrapped in the unassuming guise of the invisible. Imagine, if you can, the physical sensation of standing in the freezing rain, ignored, dismissed, and mocked by the very people you once sacrificed your soul to save. This is exactly what unfolded at the primary checkpoint of the Fort Hammond Military Intelligence Directorate, situated just 40 miles outside of Washington, D.C., on a bleak, iron-gray Tuesday in late November. The rain at Fort Hammond didn't just fall, it hammered against the earth with a vengeful persistence, cold and unrelenting, turning the manicured government lawns into sucking mud and slicking the black asphalt of the high-security entrance until it shone like dark, polished glass. It was the kind of weather that didn't just wet the skin, it seeped into the bones, a damp, gnawing chill that no amount of coffee or thermal layers could truly chase away. Inside the reinforced, heated glass enclosure of the main guard post, Private First Class Ryan Miller adjusted the space heater at his feet for the third time in 10 minutes. He was 22 years old, fresh out of advanced infantry training, and possessed that specific kind of arrogance that only comes to young men who have been given a badge and a gun, but have never actually seen the world burn. He was eager to prove that he was a soldier who followed the rules to the letter, a guardian of the gate. He had been on post for 6 hours, and the crushing boredom of a Tuesday afternoon was beginning to itch at the back of his mind. He watched the high-definition monitors with hawk-like intensity, checking every vehicle, every ID badge, every subtle movement along the perimeter fence. To him, the world was binary, authorized or unauthorized, friend or threat, compliant or hostile. He had not yet learned that the real world is almost entirely composed of gray.
Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw her. She was walking up the long, restricted approach road, a solitary, almost ghostly figure moving slowly against the driving wind. She looked to be in her late 80s, perhaps even pushing 90. Her coat was a dull, shapeless beige wool, heavy with absorbed rainwater, darker at the shoulders where the downpour had soaked through to the lining. She leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane, her steps small, measured, and precarious, fighting for traction on the slick, oil-stained wet pavement. She carried no umbrella to shield her face, only a small, worn leather handbag clutched tightly to her side like a shield. To Private Miller, watching her approach through the distortion of the rain-streaked, bulletproof glass, she was an anomaly. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like a nuisance. She looked like someone's grandmother who had wandered away from a nursing home and gotten hopelessly lost on the highway. When she finally reached the heavy steel bollards of the gate, she stopped. She took a breath, physically composing herself against the wind, and tapped gently on the glass. Miller sighed, a long, loud exhalation of frustration. He rolled his eyes, checking the time. He slid the heavy window open just 2 inches, letting a violent gust of freezing air and the roar of the rain into his warm, sterile booth. "Ma'am, you can't be here," he said, his voice clipped, loud and impatient. He didn't wait for her to speak. He assumed she was deaf or confused. "This is a restricted military installation. You are trespassing on federal property. You need to turn around and go back the way you came. The highway is 2 miles back."
The woman looked up. Her face was a topographical map of deep wrinkles, etched by time, gravity, and perhaps by a lifetime of sorrow. Her hair was silver, plastered to her forehead by the unrelenting rain, but her eyes, pale, piercing blue, were startlingly clear. They lacked the confusion, dementia, or fear he usually saw in civilians who accidentally approached the gate. They were steady. They were assessing him.
She wasn't looking at his uniform, she was looking at him. "I have an appointment," she said softly. Her voice was calm, lacking the tremor usually found in people her age. It carried a strange, quiet authority, a resonance that didn't match her frail appearance. "I am here to see General Sterling." Miller scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief that misted in the cold air. "General Sterling, the base commander?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, looking down at her with a mix of pity and annoyance. "Look, lady, General Sterling doesn't have appointments with civilians. He commands the entire intelligence division. He's a 3-star general. He doesn't have tea with lost grandmas." He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering judgmentally on her muddy shoes and the fraying hem of her coat. "Especially not, well, look at you. You're soaking wet. You're confused. Do you have someone I can call? A son? A daughter who can come get you?" "Please check the log," she said. She didn't beg, she didn't raise her voice to match his. She simply stated it as a fact, ignoring his insult entirely. "My name is on the list." "There is no log for you," Miller snapped, his patience evaporating. He reached for the handle to close the window. "I'm not calling the general's office for a prank. I'm not waking up his adjutant because you forgot where you live. You need to leave, now. If you are still standing there in 1 minute, I will have to call the military police to escort you off the property, and they won't be as polite as I am." The woman didn't move. She didn't flinch at the threat of the MPs. She didn't look frightened. She simply nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. She pulled her wet collar tighter against the freezing rain and took a single step back, clearing the immediate sensor zone of the gate. "I will wait," she said. Miller shook his head, muttering to himself about senile locals, and slammed the window shut. He locked it with a definitive click. He turned his back on her, went back to his phone, scrolling through social media, deliberately ignoring the figure standing just 10 feet away in the storm.
He let her stand there for 20 minutes. The rain intensified, turning into a sheet of gray water that obscured the tree line. The woman didn't seek shelter under the slight overhang of the gate. She stood by the concrete barrier, perfectly still. Her hands, gripping the head of the cane, turned pale white, then a concerning shade of blue from the cold. Her coat was now heavy and sodden, clinging to her frail frame like a wet shroud. Yet she stood with a posture that, if Miller had looked closely, was perfectly, rigidly straight. She wasn't slouching, she wasn't shivering violently. She was waiting with the discipline of a statue, breathing rhythmically, enduring the cold as if it were an old friend she had learned to tolerate. Before we find out who she is, I have a sincere question for you to consider. If you were that young soldier, seeing an old woman standing alone in the freezing rain, would you have followed strict protocol, or would you have shown human compassion? Would you have invited her into the dry booth, or would you have left her in the cold to teach her a lesson? The sound of heavy, turbocharged engines approaching from inside the base broke Miller's concentration. He looked up at the monitors. It was the general's convoy. 2 black, up-armored SUVs flanked by military police outriders on motorcycles. They were heading toward the main gate for a scheduled off-base inspection at the Pentagon. Miller scrambled. The boredom vanished instantly, replaced by the adrenaline of performance. He straightened his uniform, shoved his phone into his pocket, checked his reflection in the dark monitor to ensure his hat was straight, and hit the button to raise the heavy steel barrier arm. He stepped out of the booth into the rain, ignoring the cold, ready to offer a sharp, perfect salute as the vehicles passed. The convoy approached with speed, the tires hissing loudly on the wet pavement. The lead SUV was a massive beast of a vehicle, tinted windows blacker than the night, American flags fluttering on the front fenders. Miller snapped to attention, his hand slicing through the air to his brow, his spine rigid. Then, chaos ensued. The lead SUV didn't speed past. As it neared the gate, the brake lights flared bright red, blinding in the gloom. The vehicle lurched forward, the tires screeching and skidding slightly on the slick concrete as the driver slammed on the brakes with emergency force. The SUV came to a halt at a strange, aggressive angle, blocking the exit. Miller froze, his hand still glued to his forehead. What did I do? His mind raced, panic rising in his chest. Did I not raise the gate high enough? Is there a threat? Is this a drill? The back door of the lead SUV flew open before the vehicle had even fully settled on its suspension. General Marcus Sterling stepped out into the rain. Sterling was a man of legend within the Corps, a 3-star general, 6'4", with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and weathered by war. He was known for his terrifying strictness, a man who could spot a uniform violation from across a parade deck. He was not a man who ran, but today he ran. He didn't care about his immaculate Class A dress uniform. He didn't care about the hat he had left on the leather seat. He didn't care about the mud splashing onto his polished shoes. He sprinted across the wet asphalt, bypassing the stunned Private Miller entirely, as if the soldier didn't exist. The general ran toward the elderly woman standing by the concrete bollard. Miller turned, his mouth slightly open, rain dripping off the brim of his cap. He watched in stunned, absolute silence as General Sterling skidded to a stop 3 feet in front of the frail, soaked old woman. Sterling, the man who intimidated senators and commanded thousands of troops, snapped his heels together. The sound cracked like a gunshot, echoing off the concrete walls of the checkpoint. He raised his hand in the sharpest, most prolonged salute Miller had ever seen. He held it, his body trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from raw emotion. "Madam Director," Sterling said. His voice was thick, cracking with a mixture of shock, horror, and deep reverence. I am mortified." The elderly woman looked at him. A small, tired smile touched her lips, softening the hard lines of her face. She slowly raised a shaking hand, reaching out to touch the general's arm, steadying him. "At ease, Marcus," she said gently. "It's just a little rain. I've survived worse than a wet afternoon." Sterling immediately broke protocol. He stripped off his heavy, waterproof trench coat, revealing his dress shirt to the elements, and draped it gently over her shoulders, wrapping her like a precious, fragile artifact. He looked at her with the eyes of a son looking at a mother, or perhaps a soldier looking at a savior who had returned from the dead. "You should have called," Sterling whispered, ignoring the rain soaking his dress shirt. "We would have sent a helicopter. We would have sent the entire protective detail. You should never be standing here like this." "I prefer to walk," she replied, gripping the lapels of his massive coat. "It keeps me grounded, and helicopter rotors are too loud for my ears these days." Then the general turned. The transformation was terrifying. The warmth and concern vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a fury that was colder than the storm. His eyes locked onto Private Miller. "Private!" Sterling roared. The sound tore through the noise of the rain and the idling engines. Miller rushed forward, his boots splashing in the puddles, his legs shaking so hard he could barely stand. "Sir! Yes, sir!" "Do you have any idea," Sterling hissed, stepping close enough that Miller could see the veins pulsing in his neck, "who you just left to freeze on the side of the road like a stray dog? Do you have any concept of who is standing before you?" "No, sir," Miller stammered, his face pale, his heart hammering against his ribs. She wasn't in the system. She had no ID. She looked like—" "She isn't in the system," Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper that was somehow louder than his shout. "She isn't in the system because the system isn't high enough clearance to hold her name. You are looking at the reason you speak English, Private. You are looking at the reason this capital wasn't turned to radioactive ash 40 years ago." Miller looked at the old woman, then back at the general, his mind reeling, unable to process the information. "Get in the car," Sterling ordered the woman, his voice gentle again. Then he looked at Miller with eyes like flint. "And you, Private, you will report to my office immediately. Do not pass go, do not stop, you run."
20 minutes later, the atmosphere in the general's office was heavy with the scent of old leather, mahogany, and steaming Earl Grey tea. The rain lashed against the bulletproof windows, but inside it was warm. Private Miller stood at the position of attention in the center of the room. He was terrified. He expected a court-martial. He expected to be discharged and stripped of his rank. He could already see his career ending in disgrace. Instead, General Sterling was pouring tea from a silver service. The elderly woman, now dry and wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sat in the large leather chair usually reserved for the Secretary of Defense or visiting foreign dignitaries. She held the porcelain cup with both hands, the steam rising around her face, warming her skin. "Sit down, Private," the woman said. Her voice was kind, lacking any trace of malice or vindictiveness for the way he had treated her. Miller hesitated, looking at the general for permission. Sterling nodded sharply, his face still stern. Miller sat, perching nervously on the very edge of a wooden chair, his hat clutched in his hands. General Sterling walked to a heavy steel safe built into the wall behind his desk. He spun the dial, left, right, left, and pulled the heavy door open. From the depths of the safe, he pulled out a single, thin, weathered file folder. It was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. Stamped across the front in faded red ink were the words, "Eyes Only, Burn After Reading, 1968. "You judged her by her coat," Sterling said, placing the file on the desk between them with a heavy thud. "You saw an old lady. You saw weakness. You saw someone who didn't belong in your world of strength. But appearances are a luxury, Private, one she never had."
Sterling opened the file. There was a black and white photograph clipped to the top. It showed a stunningly beautiful young woman in a high-fashion cocktail dress standing on a balcony in Vienna. She held a champagne glass, her hair done in the glamorous style of the 60s, but her eyes were the same, alert, dangerous, calculating. "Her name is Elara Vance," Sterling began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. "But for 30 years, intelligence agencies across the globe knew her only as the Wraith. She didn't carry a rifle, Private. She didn't drive a tank. She carried the weight of the world in her mind." The general looked at Elara, asking for permission to speak. She took a sip of tea and nodded once, staring into the middle distance as if seeing a ghost in the corner of the room. "Let me tell you about the winter of 1968, Sterling said, "and the mission that never happened." The year was 1968. The Cold War was at its absolute freezing point. The world was a chessboard, and the pieces were nuclear warheads. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a staring contest, each waiting for the other to blink. One wrong move, one misinterpreted signal, and civilization would end in a flash of white light. Elara Vance wasn't recruited from a military academy. She wasn't a soldier. She was a linguistics professor at a small university in New England, possessed with a terrifying gift for patterns. She could look at a page of random numbers and see the code hidden within. She could listen to a conversation in a crowded room and hear what wasn't being said. The agency found her, and they didn't train her to shoot. They trained her to disappear. Her training was brutal, but not in the way soldiers endure. She wasn't forced to march with a rucksack. She was placed in isolation boxes for days to test her mental fortitude against silence. She was interrogated by her own instructors, deprived of sleep and food until she couldn't remember her real name. She was taught to pick locks, hotwire cars, and memorize architectural blueprints in seconds. But mostly, she was taught to lie so perfectly, so completely, that she believed the lie herself. Her mission profile was deep cover infiltration. In the autumn of 1968, she was deployed to East Berlin. Her cover, a French art curator named Céline. Her target, the inner circle of the Soviet High Command's Weapons Development Division. For 2 years, Elara lived a lie. Every morning she woke up in a cold apartment in East Berlin, knowing that one slip-up, One wrong word, one inconsistent facial expression would lead to a torture cell in the basement of the KGB headquarters and an unmarked grave. She attended galas, laughed at the jokes of men who signed death warrants, and drank wine with the wives of generals who wanted to burn her country to the ground. The isolation was crushing. She had no friends, she had no family. She couldn't speak English. Her handler was a voice on a dead telephone line once a month. She was completely, utterly alone in the lion's den. Her primary target was General Anatoly Korpov, the brilliant but reclusive head of a secret project codenamed Midnight Sun. Intelligence suggested the Soviets were developing a satellite weapon capable of bypassing American radar and striking any city in the US within minutes. Washington was panicking. They needed blueprints. They needed proof.
Alara spent 6 months just getting an introduction to Korpov. She engineered a chance meeting at an opera house, discussing the finer points of Tchaikovsky during the intermission. Korpov, a man of deep culture despite his brutal profession, was charmed. He was lonely, surrounded by sycophants and spies of his own. In Celine, he found an intellectual equal. She slowly became a fixture in his social circle. She became his confidant. But spycraft isn't like the movies. There were no car chases or explosions. It was a game of inches. It was Alara noticing that Korpov's driver changed his route on Tuesdays. It was spotting a smudge of blue clay on the general's boots, clay that was only found in a specific restricted zone 10 miles outside the city. It was holding her breath while she rifled through his coat pockets during a dinner party, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She began to piece the puzzle together. She broke into Korpov's private study during a storm, photographing documents with a camera smaller than a lipstick tube. She deciphered encrypted notes left in his trash. The intelligence she gathered was terrifying. Midnight Sun wasn't just a satellite, it was an automated launch system. If it went online, the logic of mutually assured destruction would break. The US would be forced to strike first to prevent it. War was inevitable. Then came the order from Washington: extract the blueprints and terminate the target. Alara was ready. She had the access. She had the poison, a clear, tasteless liquid provided by the CIA that mimicked a massive heart attack. It would be untraceable. She had a boat waiting at the Spree River to smuggle her back to the west.
But Alara was not a killer by nature. She was an analyst, and something in the data didn't sit right. She spent sleepless nights reviewing the photographed documents in her apartment, magnifying the negatives with a jeweler's loupe. She looked at the schematics until her eyes burned. She looked at Korpov's personal diary, which she had copied page by page. And then, staring at a complex guidance equation, she saw the pattern that everyone else at the CIA had missed. The weapon had a flaw. A deliberate, massive flaw in the guidance chip architecture. It would never work. It was designed to fail. The integer sequence for the orbital decay was inverted. It was a subtle error, one that looked like a mistake, but Alara knew Korpov. He didn't make math mistakes. Why would General Korpov, the most brilliant engineer in the Soviet Union, build a broken weapon? She realized the truth on the very night she was supposed to kill him. Korpov wasn't building a weapon to destroy the West. He was sabotaging his own country's program from the inside. He was stalling. He was creating a dummy project to waste the Soviet budget, to tie up resources, and to prevent a real functioning weapon from being built by someone else. He wasn't the monster. He was the dam holding back the flood. Washington didn't know. They saw a threat. They saw a weapon. If Alara followed her orders, if she stole the plans and killed Korpov, the Soviets would replace him. They would put a hardliner in charge, someone competent, someone who would fix the flaw and build a working weapon. Killing the enemy would actually start World War III. She tried to contact her handler. She tapped out a frantic message in Morse code on her shortwave radio.
"Abort," she signaled. "Target is friendly. Repeat, target is sabotaging the project from within. Do not engage." The reply came back cold and hard, a series of clicks that sealed her fate. "Negative. Intelligence confirmed. Execute order immediately. Extraction team standing by." She was alone. Her own government was ordering her to make a mistake that would end the world. She had minutes to decide. Does she follow orders and be a hero in the eyes of the agency, or does she commit treason to save the future?
Ilara stood in Korpov's study. It was late. The fire was dying in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The general was in the next room, pouring drinks, humming a melody from the opera they had seen months ago. The poison was in her hand, a tiny glass vial that felt heavy as lead. She made her choice. She capped the vial and put it back in her purse. Instead, she reached into her waistband and took out her suppressed pistol. But she didn't raise it to kill him. She walked into the living room. Korpov looked up, smiling, handing her a glass of sherry. "To art, Celine, or to friendship?" "My name is not Celine," Ilara said. She spoke in Russian now, shedding the French accent she had worn like a mask for 2 years. "And you are not building a weapon, General. You are building a paper tiger." Korpov dropped the glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, sherry spilling like blood. He reached for his shoulder holster, his face twisting in shock. "Don't," Ilara said. She had her gun drawn, but it was pointed at the door, not at him. Her eyes were pleading. "The Americans are coming for you. My team. They think you are the threat. They don't know you sabotaged the guidance chips. I know. I saw the equations. I saw the zero-sum error you introduced." Korpov stared at her, his hand hovering over his weapon. He was pale, trembling. You are CIA?" "I am," she said, "and I am disobeying a direct order to keep you alive. Because if you die, a real warmonger takes your place. We have to leave, now. The cleanup crew is 10 minutes away." She had just become a traitor to her own agency to save the enemy general.
The next hour was a blur of terror. Ilara knew the CIA extraction team, a specialized cleanup crew, would be arriving to verify the kill. When they found Korpov alive and saw Ilara helping him, they would kill them both. Loose ends were not permitted in this game. "We cannot go to the Americans," Korpov said, grabbing a satchel of essential files. "And I cannot go to the KGB. I am a dead man." "There is a third way," Ilara said, her mind racing through the contingency plans she had memorized. She drove them through the icy, dark streets of East Berlin in Korpov's official state car. She used her knowledge of the city's underbelly, the smugglers' routes and black market alleys she had mapped. They ditched the car in a narrow alleyway behind a bakery and moved on foot through the sewer system to avoid the checkpoints. The smell was atrocious, a mix of rot and industrial waste, but they kept moving. Above them, sirens wailed. The city was waking up. Both the KGB and the CIA were now hunting them. They were the two most wanted people in the city, caught between two superpowers. They reached the sector border near a bombed-out church, miles away from the famous Checkpoint Charlie. It was a dead zone, a place where the wall was old and crumbling, watched only by sporadic patrols. Ilara had arranged a dead drop extraction here for extreme emergencies, but she had to signal a specific contact, a double agent working for British intelligence, MI6, a man who owed her a life debt. They waited in the freezing mud for what felt like hours. Korpov was an old man. The cold was getting to him. He was failing. "Leave me," he whispered, pressing the satchel of documents into her hands. "Take the proof. Show your people what I did. Clear your name." "No," Ilara whispered back, gripping his arm. "We finish this together." When the contact arrived, it wasn't a rescue team. It was a single man in dark clothes carrying a collapsible ladder and wire cutters. As Korpov began to climb the ladder, headlights swept the alleyway. Tires shrieked. The CIA cleanup crew had found them. "Halt!" a voice screamed in English from the darkness. "Drop the weapon!" Ilara shoved Korpov up the last few rungs, pushing him over the wall into the waiting arms of the British agents on the western side. She turned to face the lights. She could have climbed. She could have tried to scramble over the concrete, but she knew they needed a target. If she climbed, they would shoot Korpov before he hit the ground. She needed him to buy time. She stepped out into the blinding glare of the headlights, dropping her gun and raising her hands high. "Don't shoot!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "I am Agent Vance. I am securing the asset." She bought Korpov 6 seconds. That was all he needed to disappear into the west. She was taken into custody by her own people. She was thrown into the back of a van, handcuffed and silenced. She was interrogated for 3 weeks in a windowless room in Virginia. They called her a traitor. They said she had failed the mission. They said she had been turned by the enemy. It wasn't until Korpov, safe in a safe house in London, was debriefed by the heads of MI6 and the CIA that the truth came out. He laid out the schematics. He explained that Ilara had seen what the entire analytic division had missed. He explained that she had saved the strategic balance. She had prevented a nuclear escalation by keeping him alive. The agency realized their mistake, but in the world of intelligence, mistakes are never admitted publicly. The embarrassment was too great. Ilara wasn't court-martialed, but she wasn't celebrated either. The mission was buried. The files were burned. She was forced into early retirement, given a modest pension, and told to never speak of it again. No medals, no parades, no recognition. Just a quiet life in a small house in Maryland, while the world spun on, safe because of a choice she made in a split second.
Back in the general's office, the silence was absolute. General Sterling closed the file. He placed his hand on top of it as if sealing the history back inside. Private Miller was staring at the old woman with his mouth slightly open. He looked at her frail hands, the hands that had held a gun against a door to protect an enemy, the hands that had waved away a rescue to save a timeline. He looked at her face, seeing not wrinkles, but the scars of a silent war. "She saved the world, Private," Sterling said softly. "And we retired her to a small house in the suburbs. She comes here once a year, on the anniversary of that night, to look at the names of the friends she lost. And today, you made her wait in the rain." Ilara adjusted her blanket. She looked at Miller, not with anger, but with a deep, sad wisdom. She reached out and took a cookie from the tray. "You are doing your job, young man," she said. "Protocol is important. The world needs people who follow the rules. But sometimes you have to look at the eyes, not the uniform. Sometimes you have to listen to the silence." Miller stood up. His face was red, his eyes watering. He felt small. He felt unworthy. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small. "Thank you" felt inadequate for a debt that could never be repaid. He snapped to attention. It was the crispest, most energetic position of attention he had ever assumed in his life. He saluted her, holding it until his arm burned. "Ma'am," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. It is the greatest honor of my life to meet you." Ilara smiled, and for a second, the young, dangerous spy from the photo flickered in her face. The wraith was still there, hiding in silent plain. "At ease, soldier," she said softly. "Just, next time, maybe let an old lady sit in the dry booth. My bones aren't what they used to be."
They walk among us every day. We see them in grocery stores, counting out coupons with trembling fingers. We see them sitting on park benches, feeding pigeons. We see them waiting at bus stops, moving slowly, holding up the line. We see wrinkles. We see gray hair. and we see slow. We assume they're just remnants of the past, people whose time is gone. But we forget that these men and women are the reason we have a present. They are the titans who held the sky up when it was falling. They are the ones who made the hard choices in the dark so that we could live in the light. Ilara Vance's story reminds us of a powerful truth. True heroism is rarely loud. It doesn't always come with a medal or a parade. It doesn't always end with glory. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is secret. And sometimes it's just an old woman standing in the rain, waiting to be remembered. So I have to ask you, how many real heroes have you walked past today without even knowing it? How many times have you judged a book by its worn-out cover, never knowing the epic story written inside? If this story moved you, please honor the silent heroes by hitting that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about the legends history tried to hide. Stay curious, stay respectful, and remember, you never know who is standing next to you.